It's said that once you've been to Africa, the continent is locked in your heart forever. The deep cultural heritage is unmistakable and unchanging. The same can be said for the Middle East, where the people of Israel have passed down their traditions for centuries. But the Lemba are something completely different. This tribe, who live in Zimbabwe and South Africa, claim they are direct descendants of the 12 tribes of Israel. Is it possible they are who they say they are? Astonishingly, the facts support their miraculous oral tradition. When the nation of Israel was formally reestablished in 1948, there was the hope by some that Jews everywhere would become unified once again. After all, God is faithful to his promises to the people of Israel, specifically. I will watch over and care for Israel, and I will bring them back here again. I will build them up and not tear them down. I will plant them and not uproot them. Inspired by this prophetic promise of God, a great pilgrimage began, a journey made by Jews across the globe to mend a fracturing of people that occurred centuries ago. In the 8th century BC, as noted by historians and the Bible in 1 Kings, the Assyrian Empire conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, captured its people, and dispersed them over Assyrian territory. Historians say some were killed, many were blended into other cultures, and others fled. Thus began the tradition of the lost tribes of Israel. Lemba oral tradition passed on through generations says they came from the rabbinical tribe, the Levites. The Lemba say they fled their original home and traveled to Senna in modern-day Yemen, where they became traders and craftsmen until they were forced to escape war or natural disaster. This drove the Lemba across the Red Sea to Africa. During their journey down the African continent, tradition says the Lemba built great cities of stone. This is where science comes in. Archaeologists have verified the existence of these cities. In addition, at these stone city sites, many artifacts have been discovered. These facts are a direct tie to the oral tradition handed down by generations of Lemba. Tribes all over Africa have kept their traditions and customs, but the Lemba are like no other tribe. Strict adherence to Jewish customs have been watched over by Lemba rabbis. Despite losing their original Torah on the journey from Israel to Zimbabwe, all oral teachings and traditions have been maintained. The same kind of oral teaching described in the Old Testament. Dietary laws, including kosher standards and restrictions on meat, are obeyed. Circumcision. Intermarriage has been strictly forbidden to preserve the culture and bloodline. Traditional rabbinical clothing is worn. In a place thousands of miles away from Israel, detached from all Jewish culture, these African Jews who call themselves original Hebrews are committed to their way of life that has been passed down generation to generation. Eventually, DNA testing advanced to the point where the Lemba's claims could be put to the scientific test. University of London scholar Dr. Tudor Parfit swabbed a cross-section of Lemba tribe members, and the results were astounding. The Y chromosome, passed on by many males in the population, proved to contain the Cohen modal haplotype. Among Jews, the CMH marker is most prevalent among Kohanim, or hereditary priests. In addition, this marker is one that only emanates from the Middle East. It is not found in any identifiable African roots. Even more astounding are the following stats. The CMH marker shows up in 50% of the Lemba tested. The same marker shows up only 3 to 5% of the time in the general Jewish population. What could be tradition lost in generations of translation has proven to be quite the opposite. Stories passed on generation after generation, backed up by scientific proof. The Lemba are indeed astonishing. Some claim they are one of the lost tribes of the original Israel. Others say they are another piece needed to assemble the puzzle of Jews scattered all over the world until Israel became a nation again. MJBI learned of the Lemba and has been involved on the ground with them since 2012. At that time, there were no Messianic congregations in amongst the Lemba. Today, just 5 years later, there are now 72 congregations of people meeting on the Sabbath to worship Yeshua, the Messiah, each of them led by some of the 140 MJBI Lemba graduates. God is faithful to his ancient promises. He is regathering his covenant people from the corners of the earth in preparation for the return of the Messiah. MJBI exists to train leaders for this great restoration around the world. Because every revival has influential leaders, and every influential leader has been equipped.
This is Duke University.
What really got me interested in Jewish genetic history in the beginning was just the whole question of how a people come to see themselves as a people. What are the ingredients of that? Is that primarily a social construction? Is it primarily a matter of genetic identity and continuity of that genetic identity? And those questions can be addressed, of course, partially historically, but part of those questions have to do with what the genetic relationships are amongst people. And so that got me really interested in looking into the genetics of Jewish populations, because that's, of course, a group that has a very long history of identification as a cohesive group. And when I early on got started in that work, it became immediately apparent that it's something that interested not just me, but lots of other people too. And as the work was published in technical journals, regularly people would ask me, well, what does this really mean? And I found that it wasn't that easy to explain what it really means. And over time, I finally realized that I should just sit down and try to tell the story in an accessible way. And that's how the book got started. I took the view that it wouldn't be sensible to just indiscriminately go out and start genotyping anybody that had some kind of a claim to a Jewish connection. But there was one group in particular that really was quite intriguing, and that's the Lemba from southern Africa. And while they did not consider themselves a lost tribe in a narrow sense, they did consider themselves to have an origin in the ancient Israelite kingdom. And they have a story of dispersal from that part of the world something like 3,000 years ago, and other aspects to the story. And that part of it is not so distinctive by itself, because there are other groups that have stories like that. But there had been a study done, perhaps 10 or 15 years back now, a bit longer maybe, by a South African geneticist that showed that some of the Y chromosomes in this group, the Lemba, were Semitic as opposed to Bantu. And that distinction is quite easy to make with genetic markers on the Y chromosome. And that was surprising, because the Lemba look like their Bantu neighbors, and yet they have a lot of Y chromosomes that are Semitic. So that's intriguing, but that doesn't make it a Jewish connection. So with that starting point, we thought, well, might there be some way to see whether the Semitic Y chromosomes that these Lemba carry, whether they might have, in fact, a specifically Jewish origin? So that's what got us started. When you think about Jewish chromosomes as opposed to Semitic chromosomes, that's a hard distinction to make because we know that that's where Jewish Y chromosomes come from, that part of the world. And so a lot of Y chromosomes, it'd be hard to tell whether they got into the Lemba from specifically a Jewish source or, for example, from Arab traders or something like that. However, the studies that we had done with the priesthood had identified this one Y chromosomal type, which we called the Cohen modal haplotype, the most common type in the Cohenim. That type is not very common in non-Jewish populations. In fact, it's pretty rare. So if we happen to bump into that type in the Lemba, we could say, hey, it's pretty likely it's a Jewish origin because it's not too common elsewhere. So that's about all we had to go on, and off we went. And sure enough, when we looked in the Lemba, 10% of them, or a little bit more, had this type, which is primarily found in Jewish populations. And that was a stunner, I have to say. Every so often you do this work and you see something, you say, that's amazing. And that was a stunner. And not only did we see this particular Y chromosomal type that seems characteristic of Jewish populations in the Lemba, but it was clustered in a particular clan within the Lemba called the Buba, and that clan is accorded a leadership role within the Lemba. So it really does sort of seem to fit together with the story that there is some kind of a ancient Jewish origin here, and maybe the Buba who are accorded a leadership role trace more to that origin. And I think that finding that chromosome there doesn't prove that historical case, but if you looked at it and said, well, what do you think is really happening? Your guess is that's what's happening. You don't very often get to do work that results in something that makes you say, wow, that's pretty neat. And when that does happen, you feel pretty lucky. And I do feel a lot of it is, in fact, luck. You start a study, and if it happens to have something in it that's striking, then you find it. And so I think science is maybe 7 or 8 parts luck and 1 or 2 parts not making mistakes, because what you have to do is just not get things wrong. But otherwise, it has to be there. And in the case of the Lemba, we got very lucky. There is something really pretty amazing sitting there in the genetic makeup of the Lemba, and we got to see it, and that was really, really exciting.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.
Groups like the Venda and speak their languages, but they maintain their origins do not lie in Africa.
I mean, as I grew up, we were told that we traveled from Judea, settled in Yemen for quite a number of years. Then we crossed into Africa. And of course, that is why we're called Lemba. Although we're black Jews, but immediately we entered Africa, then we're known as the Lemba.
The Lemba is a group with a very strong cultural identity and practices unlike that of other groups around them.
They maintain traditions which are significantly different from the traditions respected by most of the tribes in Central and Southern Africa.
Tudor Parfitt is a historian who has devoted his life to studying Judaizing groups all over the world. He's associated with the School for African and Oriental Studies in London, but lives in southern France. He's lived with the Lemba and has written several books about them. He's found that the Lemba have many practices and traditions that are more Israelite than African.
We carried the beliefs and the practices from the past with us. And we never relinquished our practices even when we were in Africa.
Professor Magda Leroux of UNISA has also lived among the Lemba and has written a book about them. She specifically researched the Lemba's Jewish Israelite-like customs and traditions.
My main purpose was to investigate the oral traditions and to compare them with the Old Testament traditions and their customs. And it was fascinating to me to discover that their way of celebrating the new moon is even older than that of the Jewish people today. is even older than that of the Jewish people today. Is even older than that of the Jewish people today. Is even older than that of the Jewish people today. And it's interesting that the Lemba still have the pre-Talmudic way of celebrating the new moon. And that is traceable.
So, Makdal believes that the Lemba have many practices that point to an ancient Israelite origin.
That has been confirmed also through our practices. The fact that we don't partake of pork, the fact that we get circumcised at a very young age, and there would be rituals which would be held immediately after circumcision, which we continue to do now. But the slaughtering, what we do is we use kosher. And the way you cut the animal, you must cut it once so that immediately it actually dies. And of course it must bleed. And bleeding has got to do with purification of the meat that you are going to eat.
All of these customs closely resemble ancient Israelite practices and have made them distinct from other black groups. Throughout history, they've been commented upon by early Arab traders centuries ago and by more recent European explorers who came into contact with them. They're also known as Kruger's Jews because as a group they had a good relationship with President Paul Kruger. They've also been called the Black Jews of Southern Africa. But how seriously can one take their oral traditions that claim they are descendants of ancient Israel who have journeyed from Jerusalem to the Yemen and then later on into Africa?
I decided to take them seriously. You know, I mean, it's difficult for our Western mind to believe those kind of things, you know, if you can't prove it. But even with proof, it's difficult for some people to believe.
Nobody believed in their story. Certainly the local Jews did not believe in their story, and most of them still do not. The whites among whom they lived didn't really believe in their story.
While there was doubt about the Lemba's claims, serious research into their practices and traditions continued. In the 1980s, their music was analyzed by Professor Margaret Nabarro, and she concluded that at some stage they had contact with the Middle East. Magda Leroux studied their cultural practices intensely for many years and concluded that they showed remarkable similarities to ancient Israel. Further indications that the Lemba indeed had contact with the Yemen, just like they had claimed, was found by Tudor Parfitt. On a trip to Yemen, he traveled with a local guide.
And I told him about my research with the Lemba and how they claim to be from a place called Senna. And he clapped his hands together and said, "I know where that is." And he brought out an ancient map of the Hadramaut. And indeed, right at the end of the Wadi, there was this place called Senna. So the next day, went with the Mukhtar in a jeep right to the end of the Wadi. We found this place. There are still people living there. And then we discovered that a whole range of local tribal names were exactly the same as the tribal names of the Lemba.
All of this was really intriguing, but far from proof of their claims. Then, cutting-edge science got involved. In the late 1990s, DNA analysis became available, and Professor Trevor Jenkins at Wits decided to do a DNA study on some Lemba men. They were astounded at the results.
The patterns on over 50% of their Y chromosomes were much more closely related to Semitic people than they were to peoples of Africa, in particular the Bantu-speaking peoples amongst whom they lived. The genetic findings are highly compatible with their claims that some of their ancestors, we would now say male ancestors, have indeed come from the Middle East.
Within a few years, more sophisticated DNA analyses were done, and Tudor Parfitt and Magda Leroux collected the DNA of 136 male Lembas.
They were compared with a whole range of African samples and, of course, a whole range of Jewish samples from different parts of the world. It was a very major study.
Again, the DNA was analysed, this time in London, by geneticist Neil Bradman.
What we found specifically is that this Cohen modal haplotype, the type of chromosome that is found at high frequency, in large numbers, in Jewish priests, was present in a particular clan of the Lemba, the Buba, where it's at a frequency of a similar amount, about 50%. So what we're saying is that the genetic data actually supports the oral history, not what one might have thought would be more likely, refutes the oral history.
So, the DNA analysis supported the idea that the Lemba were not only related to ancient Israelites, but that one of their clans is actually related to Israelite priests.
We did a new collection last year where Jewish populations throughout the world were scrutinized using the whole genome. And what it shows is that they form part of the same cluster of populations as the ancestors of the Jews. Its people came from the eastern end of the Mediterranean. These were the ancestors of the Lemba.
These results have shown that the oral traditions of the Lemba were remarkably accurate, even down to the number of Lemba men who came into southern Africa.
Trevor Jenkins maintains that it's possible more or less to say how many of the Lemba arrived in Africa. So in other words, the founding group in Africa, according to him, is some 7 or 8 people. According to the oral tradition of the Lemba, there were 15 men in a boat. Half were lost or went to the north, and the other half came into Zimbabwe and then down into South Africa eventually. So even the figures of the number of people in the boat that arrived in Africa are confirmed by genetics.
The accuracy of the Lemba stories also changed the way scholars look at the durability of oral traditions.
While modern scholars in Europe, for instance, would reckon the Old Testament traditions that it couldn't last longer than about 100 years. Oral traditions in Africa can last more than 1,000 years.
But the Lemba not only have remarkably accurate traditions about their origins, they have another tradition, an intriguing tradition, about being the custodians of one of the most sought-after objects in history, the mysterious lost Ark of the Covenant. The Lemba have another intriguing and ancient oral tradition, a tradition about their involvement with the legendary Ark of the Covenant. Joe Rawlinga grew up with this tradition.
We traveled from Yemen into Africa, traveled from the north and came into southern Africa. And indeed, we carried the ark, which was a holy drum, and I think it still remains holy now.
The Lemba refer to this object they identify with the ark as the Ngoma Lungundu, the drum of God. When Tudor Parfitt lived with the Lemba in Zimbabwe, he also encountered stories about the Lemba and the ark.
After my first journey through Africa, trying to determine the origins and the roots of the Lemba, I wrote my first book on them. And in it I mentioned the traditions of the Ngoma Lungundu, which comes from an Arabic source. And so in this particular case, a medieval traveller views a group of people travelling south, and they are carrying a mighty drum, and it is referred to by the name of Arahim. Now, Arahim could be Arabic, sounds like it might be Arabic for the All Merciful, one of the names of God. It could also be a slight transformation of the Hebrew word for God, which is Elohim. El and R are often transposed, so it could be a different form of Elohim.
Elohim is the Hebrew word used to refer to God, and Parfitt says that if this is the case, men carrying the object clearly had to have some connection with ancient Israel. Magda learnt about the traditions of the Ngoma Lungundu from the Lemba themselves.
And they told me, yes, we were the carriers of the Ngoma Lungundu, the priestly family of the Lemba, the Buba, the Kohanim. They were the carriers of the Ngoma Lungundu, and they carried it from the east coast of Africa southwards into Africa.
Richard Wade is an astronomer and historian with a special interest in the Lemba. He also came across a tradition linking the Lemba and the Ngoma Lungundu with remarkable parallels to the stories about the Ark of the Covenant.
As they go south, they meet different people who are hostile, and they incorporate the people simply by beating the drum. And the people die, and they are killed. The drum would be used in the same way as the biblical Ark of the Covenant.
Reports about this strange object have been circulating for many years, and early European explorers in the area of southern Africa have also commented on it.
The earliest story that I could get about the Ngoma Lungundu was recorded by von Sickert in 1952. He was a missionary who worked among the Lemba people in Zimbabwe, and he actually observed the similarities between the Ark of the Covenant and the Ngoma Lungundu. That was in the 1950s.
He really did know them, he lived with them, he spoke the language, he wrote a good deal about their traditions.
Some of the oral traditions of the other tribes in southern Africa also point to the Lemba being custodians of a very special object. At the Zata Ruins Museum, the curator Mpho Tikosi says the Lemba and Venda ancestors met up in Central Africa and journeyed together to southern Africa. With them came the Ngoma Lungundu, and only the Lemba priests were allowed to carry it.
So they were given instructions on how to treat this drum, because it was not supposed to touch the ground. If it touches the ground, great calamities will happen to that community, and they were not supposed to touch it with their bare hands. Even the Balemba who were chosen to carry it, if you touch it, you die instantly. So this drum had magic. So they were given the drum in order to protect them when they were moving from Central Africa to the south until they arrived here. So if they meet the enemies on the way, they will beat it once. They had a person called the high priest, Zomuladzimu, who was responsible for carrying the messages from the gods to the people. So he was the one who was responsible for beating the drum if they meet the enemies on the way. So if he beat the drum once, the enemies will fall asleep. And then the other thing is that if they have drought when they are on the way, the high priest will beat it 5 times, and then rain will start pouring at the same time.
So an independent tradition from within the Venda people also confirms the existence of an object, perhaps drum-like, that was carried only by Lemba priests and which functioned much like the Ark of the Covenant.
Concentrated in the shadow of the Soutpansberg Mountains in the far north of South Africa. To the casual observer, they look and live much like any other traditional Southern African community. But if you scratch below the surface, there are some intriguing differences.
Here I am in South Africa, and there are these men wearing skull caps and tali shoulder wraps. You would see this in any synagogue in America or Israel, but I never thought I'd see it here in South Africa.
I want to find out how these people seem to have Jewish customs. Samuel Moeti is president of the Lemba Cultural Association.
Pleasure.
So, I'll be honest, I came into this village and the first word I heard was shalom,
yes.
A Hebrew word.
Yes.
How's that possible? How is it that the Lemba are speaking Hebrew?
The Lembas are the original Hebrews, and they were scattered, as you know, and they crossed into Africa. So they were scattered all over. So in South Africa, in many parts of South Africa, you find the Lembas who are actually Hebrews.
Hebrews. So the Lembas claim to be descendants of ancient Israelites?
Not claim, they are.
They are?
They are.
Okay.
We are the original African Hebrew. We are scattered all over.
Can you give me a few examples of some of the Jewish
Yes,
sources?
we don't partake of pork.
Okay.
We don't mix milk with meat.
It sounds to me like the Lemba have a unique culture surrounded by others who do not practice the same way.
That is correct. We always believe that the Jewish people who live all over the world are our brothers because we come from the same root.
Could it be that the Lemba are a lost tribe of Israel? To answer the question, I have to turn the clock back some 2,700 years, to the time of the mighty Assyrians. Back then, Assyria was the greatest imperial power the world had ever seen. And it had set its expansionist sights on the northern kingdom of Israel. The northern kingdom, composed of 10 tribal groups, was completely destroyed. Any surviving Israelites were enslaved and taken to Assyria, what is now the nation-states of Iraq and Syria. Little is known about the fate of these lost tribes, but for 2,700 years, hope remained. Could the Israelites have regrouped? Could some have escaped their captors and fled? Could a group of wandering Israelites have survived the elements and continued on, faithful in some land far from home? The Lemba story goes like this. Thousands of years ago, they were forced out of Israel and settled in a place called Senna, which is believed to be the present-day Yemen. There, they lived as traders and craftsmen until war or natural disaster pushed them across the Red Sea and into Africa. Then began a slow migration south. Along the way, according to the Lemba, they built great stone cities. It's a claim that's fascinated archaeologists. Why? Because the ruins of ancient stone cities still exist in southern Africa today. It's also where I need to be exploring next.
I had no idea how big this site was.
Their oral traditions speak of a great journey through Africa and of the great stone cities that they left along the way. I'm on my way to see one now.
The city of stone I'm going to is called Mamlekhet, and it's only a few kilometers down this road.
Not many people know about this place. In fact, it's hidden on a huge cattle ranch, and I've had to get special permission to explore it. It's very rarely visited, even by archaeologists. I'm hoping it still has some clues to the Lemba story.
Michael?
Hello.
Hello. Hop on in.
To help me make sense of it, I've asked historian Dr. Magda LaRue to come with me to the site. She's been studying the Lemba for years and has just published a book on the similarities between their social customs and those of the Old Testament Israelites.
So Magda, there are specific parallels between the religious practices of the Lemba today and the religious practices of ancient Israelites.
Definitely. They've got remnants of an ancient type of Israelite religion. So in a way, they conserve this very special ancient type of
It's like old school religion.
Yes.
But how do they maintain that religious identity? How did they keep it intact for so many years when there was this long journey from Israel down to South Africa?
You see, that's the question. I think it's by means of the oral traditions. But they kept themselves separate from other groups. They lived with other peoples, moving with them, migrated southwards. No, that is one of their salient characteristics, is that they keep up their culture. They just live it. You know,
Is this cultural resilience the key to the Lemba's survival during their epic journey across 4,000 miles of land and sea? And could there still be any physical evidence here at Mamlekhet which supports the Lemba's claim to having made the journey? This once thriving settlement is now easy to miss, so we've asked one of the farm workers to take us to the site. Waiting for us at the top is archaeologist Richard Wade. He believes he's found some material evidence which links this site with both Yemen and Zimbabwe, two of the places the Lemba say they traveled through.
Yeah, hi.
Come and have a look at these amazing things here. There's a potter's weaving weight.
A potter's weaving weight.
Saw this thing. It's the form of a spinning jenny, and this, of course, is found in Yemen. But basically, this, apart from that, look what else. This is an amazing, I would say, not decoration, but inscription. I've seen this before. You make out some sort of a letter, followed by a dot, followed by another letter, followed by another sort of a letter, and a dot, and another letter. Or is it just decoration? Yeah. But the problem is we find this in Yemen.
This?
Yes.
You just found this, correct?
Yeah, it was lying.
You're just sitting here?
Yeah, there's another.
And this?
Here.
This tells you what?
Well, this is a weaver. There was weaving done here. There was cotton grown. There was something with the trade. And the only people who do that are basically mentioned by the oral traditions of the Basena people or the Lemba.
So this says the Lemba were not just living here. They were actually, they had a big enough community that they were weaving.
Yes, this is like a castle with almost a little kingdom, possibly.
Richard believes the Lemba of Mamlekhet shared more than ancient technologies with the Israelites of Yemen. They shared the same culture.
The inscription that's written into that wall is significant because it ties this place with other Lemba communities?
I would say so.
Okay. Cylindrical tower.
It seems both experts are convinced this place is definitely the work of ancient Lemba communities.
The question that I'm wondering is that this is a significant amount of work. Is there anything physically, archaeologically, that was found here that connects the Lemba with other places that they claim to have traveled through?
Yes, there are amazing collections of beads which are found here and are found in Zimbabwe, but it's a specific collection of beads. I'm not talking just about one or two of them. And these beads are directly related to Tarim and Sayut, where the harbors are of the Sena people, originally coming through from Yemen. But nowhere else.
So these beads, just take a look at them real quick, reinforce the Lemba's claim
Very much.
that they did indeed travel from Israel into Yemen and then south through Africa. This is actually the first physical proof I've gotten of the people here coming from someplace to the north. And the Lemba today claim this as their heritage.
Then it is.
The most intriguing feature at the Machima site is the remains of a mysterious conical tower, which still has archaeologists scratching their heads.
But I'm not really clear what it was used for.
Nobody really could tell you unless they lived there. But is it a lookout tower? No, it's too low for the rest. You would have your lookout tower higher there. So we have a very significant, well-made little conical tower, which is very much the only one I've ever seen south of Zimbabwe.
Really?
Oh, yes. Zimbabwe's great enclosure has got the large one. There's quite a few there. There's a small one, but this is not seen in South Africa.
A Zimbabwe connection is interesting because that's one of the places the Lemba say they traveled through.
And these are the Lemba.
Then this was built by the same people who built the one in Zimbabwe?
Definitely the same people. The same stonework is here, the same bead types, the same weaving technology.
Richard lays out some convincing evidence that the Lemba did indeed build this place, and could also have built the largest ancient stone city in sub-Saharan Africa, where I'm heading next. The ruins of Great Zimbabwe.
It might be a bit of a long shot, but it's definitely worth a closer look.
Now, I'm backtracking their journey to explore a structure they claim to have built centuries earlier. The site covers an area of 4 square miles, the largest ancient stone city in sub-Saharan Africa. As I walk around, I can imagine this place as a bustling community, the hub of an empire that ruled over a vast area of southern Africa, a center for trade from far and wide. The Zimbabweans are very proud of it, and who can blame them? I'm here to meet Dr. Edward Matenga, the site's curator and an expert on the history of Great Zimbabwe.
Wow. So this whole area was a city that ruled the kingdom.
Yes, the first buildings were laid on the hill, and then it extended into the valley.
You know, I saw parts of those buildings coming up here, but I had no idea how big this site was.
In the background, we've got the biggest building, which is the Great Enclosure.
The Great Enclosure is that big circular one?
Yes.
Wow. What was this place for?
This is the Great Enclosure.
Yeah?
It was built for the paramount wife of the king.
For the first wife of the king?
Yes.
So
Edward tells me that the Great Enclosure was the last structure at the site to be built, around 1400 AD. What I really want to see is the conical tower that Richard Wade says is the same as the one we saw at Machima.
It's called the Conical Tower.
Conical Tower. What was it used for?
Your guess is as good as mine. It wasn't used for anything other than being a sort of a ceremonial monument.
Really? Is there an entrance? A door?
No.
So I don't get it. It's just a big cone of rock.
Yeah, it's all sort of it's pegged in stones, and there's no entrance.
As Richard Wade told me, no one knows for sure what these towers were for. But the fact that both Machima and Great Zimbabwe have them supports the claim that the same people were involved in building both sites, which brings me to the big question.
Edward, who built this place?
This site was built by ancestral Shona communities. The Shona today are the predominant inhabitants of Zimbabwe. They are a segment of the Bantu.
Edward believes that it's his ancestors, the Shona, who built this place. So where does that leave the Lemba?
So this entire community was built by the Shona?
Yes, sir, this is the only site, as I told you. There are about 300 sites.
Historian Magda LaRue told me that the Lemba lived and worked alongside other communities while maintaining their own identity and culture. So it's still possible that the Lemba were involved in this place's construction. And since this type of architecture was unique in Africa at the time, maybe it was the Lemba who provided the equally unique stonework seen here at Great Zimbabwe. Whoever built this place, it was a real feat of engineering. These walls are solid granite, not soft sandstone.
You said that there were 15 million stones put in this wall?
Yes, this was a big job.
I'm excited to get back to the Lemba to see what they make of this. And I've got the perfect opportunity. It's the Lemba's annual festival, and I've been invited. It's hard to believe that these people, who to the casual observer look just like the other African communities they live among, actually do have DNA passed down from Middle Eastern forefathers. This proves that when it comes to race, looks really can be deceiving. This annual festival is a chance for the oral history and traditional songs of the Lemba to be passed on to the next generation. This song tells the story of the Lemba's journey all the way from Israel to South Africa. Having traced this journey, I'm eager to hear what Samuel Moeti thinks about the DNA evidence.
So the genetic testing actually proved to the doubters what you and your forefathers have been saying for generations. That must be exciting news.
It is.
I'll be honest, I hadn't heard of the Lemba. I knew very little about the people. But having spent time making the journey from Jerusalem down through Zimbabwe, having spent time here at this festival, seeing what your people are all about, I can only sum it up in one word, and it's shalom.
Shalom.
We've seen how science has backed up the claims of the Lemba in the face of years of doubt and prejudice. The archaeological clues, the DNA evidence, and the Lemba's own oral history add up to a very convincing argument.
So this is why I think the genetic component is so compelling, because it's hard to fake the DNA. It's in your blood.
It reminds me that first impressions can often be misleading. It was hard to believe that a tribe of black Africans could be the descendants of ancient Israelites. But that's exactly what they appeared to be.
Brothers and sisters, they are there. We are not lost. We are scattered. We are original Hebrew.
We start with a very interesting conversation with anthropologist and filmmaker Dr. Malka Shabtai, who is here with a very special guest, Dr. Robson Origa, researcher and scholar. You also wrote a book, which I'm going to hold up here as well. If you could explain, for those, obviously it would be a great read for people to buy it and read it, but explain what it is about the Lemba customs that goes back so far to the history of the Jewish people.
Yes, as an ancient community which hails from the ancient kingdom of Israel and came to Africa via Yemen and established themselves in southern Africa, we have customs that goes back to pre-rabbinic Judaism. Customs that goes back to pre-rabbinic Judaism. Customs that goes back to pre-rabbinic Judaism. Customs that goes back to pre-rabbinic Judaism, if I may use the term that is there.
Of course.
In terms of sacred times, in terms of rituals, of which the central one is circumcision and keeping of Shabbat, observing the coming of the new moon, celebrating Pesach, of which the word that we grew up knowing is Pesach, and also celebrating the coming of the new year and many other sacred times.
So interesting. So you've also, obviously you do a lot of work in Africa, Ethiopia, I mean everywhere. You're everywhere all the time. Explain why this Lemba story is such an important component. We know about many different communities throughout Africa that feel a connection to the Jewish people, but the Lemba actually has a Y chromosomal connection to the Kohanim. Can you explain that first from an anthropology perspective?
Yes. We are all very much familiar with the stories of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. But the Lemba case is different, is unique. First of all, because of their origin that is most directly connected to King Solomon. First of all, because of their origin that is most directly connected to King Solomon. First of all, because of their origin that is most directly connected to King Solomon. First of all, because of their origin that is most directly connected to King Solomon. Now, there is more things to be explored, but this community has a very long history of moving around, of migrating from place to place, of searching their Mount Sinai and the relatives that have been spread out throughout all over the places. And as other Jewish communities, many have been lost to Christianity, to Islam. But there is a core of people that have been holding to their identity and origin and want to continue and go on with it. And we are witnessing now this process that it's happening in front of our eyes with leaders like Dr. Rabson Uriga and other people in South Africa and Zimbabwe, and with the assistance and sometimes interference of international Jewish organizations, and sometimes interference of international Jewish organizations, and sometimes interference of international Jewish organizations, and sometimes interference of international Jewish organizations. And now we are trying to build up a bridge between Israeli people, I would say, not the establishment yet, and this unique community. Because, as I always keep saying to you, each of these communities are part of our general Jewish history. And we need to find a place and the correct definitions and opportunities to be more inclusive and not only and not keep thinking that there is one way to be a Jew and all should follow. They were there before us.
Right.
And not keep thinking that there is one way to be a Jew and all should follow. They were there before us.
Right.
And not keep thinking that there is one way to be a Jew and all should follow. They were there before us.
Right.
And not keep thinking that there is one way to be a Jew and all should follow. They were there before us.
Right.
The Lemba are a group of Jewish people you may have heard us talk a lot about. These people live in Zimbabwe and other nations in the southern African region. Their oral history names them as sons of Aaron, the high priests of Israel. This suggests that the Lemba have ties to the ancient tribe of Levi. More recently, DNA evidence has actually confirmed a link of the Lemba to historically Jewish people groups, particularly those bearing the Cohen, or the ancient high priestly DNA marker. Now, the Lemba's oral history explains that during the 70-year Babylonian captivity between the First and the Second Temple periods, their ancestors married and then raised families with pagan women. When they returned to Jerusalem after the captivity, Ezra and Nehemiah insisted that they leave their foreign wives and their foreign families to demonstrate a complete return to the God of Israel. But a certain portion of the priests wouldn't, and instead they chose to leave Jerusalem and they migrated south, where they settled in Yemen on the Arabian Peninsula through an area historically called Lemba. After a time of peace, they began to experience persecution a few centuries later from Muslims growing in the region, and so they crossed the Red Sea into various parts of Africa. Some of the Lemba made their way through Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Mozambique to settle in eventually what's modern-day Zambia, Zimbabwe, and South Africa, also into modern-day Mozambique, a very similar path to the spice routes running through the ancient African world. Since the Lemba left Israel, they've retained a strong sense of their Israelite heritage and identity. Their religious practices include circumcising their boys, forbidding marriage outside the Lemba community, and even obeying biblical dietary laws originally given to the children of Israel. The Lemba even have their own kosher butchers to ensure that they adhere to ancient biblical standards. Over the years, While many Lemba became believers in Jesus, they continued to maintain their Jewish, more specifically their Levite identity and customs, but they struggled to understand where they fit in both faith community as believers in Jesus, as well as in the Jewish community, not to mention the surrounding cultures near them. Many in the larger community often pressed the Lemba to give up their Jewish identity as irrelevant and historical, while others wanted them to renounce Jesus as Messiah in order to preserve their Jewish or Lemba identity. When we here at Jewish Voice first met the Lemba, they saw other Jewish believers in Jesus who continue to regard our Jewish identity as a vital part of who we are and who God created us to be. The Lemba were thrilled to find a community of believers known as Messianic Jews, Jewish believers in Jesus, where they could fully belong, both as Lemba, as Jews, and as those who profess faith in Jesus the Messiah.
And Egypt was Israel, the nation of Israel. So now they're kind of in the middle of a lot of controversy, and then they were too. Now, there was supposed to be something special about this nation of Israel. Does anyone know what that was? They were supposed to represent their God to the other nations of the world. Maybe we've heard the phrase children of Israel before, or something like that. Well, Sennacherib, meanwhile, is the king of Assyria in 700 BC. And just like great kings, he wants to grow his empire. He wants to conquer the nations around him. So that's exactly what he starts doing. He starts conquering nations around Assyria. And finally, he's very successful and he ends up at Israel. Now, he's excited about the idea of conquering Israel because not only does it mean that he's stronger than Israel as a nation, but it also means if he's able to conquer them, that he's stronger than Israel's God. So that was his goal. But how do you capture an ancient empire? Well, you have to take what city?
The capital.
The capital, exactly. And does anyone know what the capital of ancient Israel was?
Jerusalem.
Jerusalem, exactly. So Sennacherib's goal is to get Jerusalem, is to capture Jerusalem. Well, he begins his invasion and his conquest, and he takes 45 cities until he gets to Lachish, which is the final city to take on his way to Jerusalem. This is the last stop, and these reliefs tell the story or depict what happened at the Battle of Lachish. All right? So let's go and look and see what an ancient battle looks like, all right? If you look right here, you can see the Assyrian soldiers. These are the slingers with the sling and the stone, long-distance warfare. Then you see the rows of archers coming along for long distance. And as we move down the line, getting closer to the city of Lachish, we see some infantrymen with spears and shields coming on, advancing on the city, okay? And then we see siege ramps that have been built, and they're marching up siege ramps. Now, in ancient times, the way that they would protect cities was by building walls around them, right? And so the way to take a city that's got a wall around it is you have to get over the wall somehow, so they build these ramps. They probably weren't actually this steep, but they did it for the relief so that they could fit more on it. So you can see soldiers, Assyrians, invading, trying to come up the siege ramps, and meanwhile, torches and stones are being thrown down by the people from Lachish to try to defend the city. You see some other defenders and archers in this tower right here from Lachish. So this is a peek into an ancient battle scene. As good as it gets, high definition. Now let's look down here. You can come a little closer. Let's look down here. Somebody tell me what you see right here.
I see slaves.
Slaves, yeah, you see some people there. What we see is two soldiers, and they've got poles, and on top of those poles are dead people. Basically, they are human shish kebabs because the Assyrians were notorious for their cruel practices. They wouldn't just kill you because that's too humane. They would torture you first and make sure you die a slow, painful, and exemplary death to the rest of your comrades because they specialized on intimidation. They did these cruel tactics in order to intimidate their enemies so that they would melt with fear as soon as they heard that the Assyrians were coming to town. I think I would be pretty scared too. Well, let's keep moving down the line. So they've gotten over the city walls, and now they've captured the city, and they're taking their plunder. They're taking their plunder. So we've got a cart and some soldiers right here, and they've got their candles. They've got some valuables that they're stealing from the city. They've got candlesticks, and they've got other valuable objects, but not only objects, they've got valuable human resources, slaves. You can see a mother and a child being carted off into slavery, into exile right here in Lachish. All right, so if you want to come to the corner, we have a chair right here, but maybe some of you can see. Tell me what you see right here in this area. Anybody see? Tell me what's going on here. Yeah, you've got the soldiers are laying out two men, and if you look carefully at their legs, you see lines on their legs. Those are exposed muscles and tendons. Because like we said, the Assyrians wouldn't just kill you, they'd torture you first. So they ripped off the flesh of these men to help them die in a more painful way, and also in order to intimidate their enemies. They were brutal. So let's continue down the line. We've got more slaves that are leaving the city. Now somebody tell me the difference between this guy and this guy. Whose side do you think this guy's on? The Assyrians, yeah, the conquerors, the Assyrians. And whose side do you think this guy's on? The slave, yeah, the people from Israel or Lachish. You can tell also by their distinctive hairstyle depicted in archaeology. The people from Israel or Lachish. You can tell also by their distinctive hairstyle depicted in archaeology. The people from Israel or Lachish. You can tell also by their distinctive hairstyle depicted in archaeology.
Please, sorry, I have to go back a little bit. I wanted to add up to what Pastor Tatra said about our footprints in Israel. How do we know that we came from Israel? Now, if you go to the book of Nehemiah, I can't remember the chapter, verse 35, it talks about a man called Senna.
Senna, yes.
So I'm happy to tell you that if you had to go back to home to Israel, we left some marks on the way. When our parents went to Yemen, they built a city and named it Senna. It's there right today.
Wow.
It's called Senna. Now, if you go from Senna, they went to Mozambique. If you go to Mozambique, there's a city called Senna in Mozambique.
Interesting.
If you come here to Zimbabwe, the Great Zimbabwe, it was supposed to be called Senna 4, but only that we are a minority, and our voice was not audible enough to be heard.
Wow.
Then the other group which crossed the Limpopo River in South Africa, they built a city and called it Senna. Even today it's called Messina. It's on the way to South Africa. Now, if you go to Israel,
yes,
there's a place near the Dead Sea.
Yeah,
there's a place. It's a city which used to be occupied by the Levites.
Okay.
Now they were surrounded by the Moabites.
Okay.
That's where you get a place called Seda also. And on the old map of Israel, there is a place called Lemba. On the old map of Israel, there is a place called Lemba. On the old map of Israel, there is a place called Lemba. I have the map on me here.
Interesting.
There's a place called Lemba. It's there. Lemba. I have a map there.
So it says, the Lemba unequivocally believe that they are direct descendants of Jewish exiles who returned from Babylon. There is a record of the sons of Senna, 3,930. Whew. That's a lot of people, fam. And we'll talk about that. In the Old Testament, in Ezra 2nd chapter, verse 35, and Nehemiah 7th chapter 7, verse 38. And it says, Parfet has located a city in modern Yemen called Senna, which the Lemba believe is their ancestral home. All right. So if Tudor Parfet, if you guys, I'm sure most of you guys are familiar with Tudor Parfet, and he has confirmed a lot of this history that the Lemba of the Lemba oral tradition, using archaeology as well as DNA. But that's a story for another day. So for today, we're focusing on the location of the Lemba. That's what we're going to do. We're going to focus on the location of the Lemba. So we mentioned Nehemiah chapter 7. So let's go to Nehemiah chapter 7, and let's start at verse 6. And so this is just to get just to kind of set the scene as to what's happening in Nehemiah. So remember, the children of Judah were taken away captive by Nebuchadnezzar. And now that the time of the captivity is over, they're coming back to Jerusalem to rebuild the city, to rebuild the walls. And this is kind of like where Nehemiah chapter 7 picks up. So let's start at chapter 6. It says, these are the children of the province that went up out of the captivity, of those that had been carried away, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away, and came again to Jerusalem and to Judah, everyone unto his city. All right. And then we're going to drop down to verse 38. And for this, I want to point out or highlight the number of the children of Seneh. So you'll see it says the children of Seneh, 3,930. So you can pretty much round it up to 4,000. And now the significance of that is that if you take the time to go through this list, if you look like, let's take for example the next few verses. Let's see, and just catch the numbers of these families. It says 973, or verse 40, 1,052. The next one, 1,247, right? And if you can go up, you can go down. But one of the things that you'll find out is that this family of Seneh was the largest family that came out of captivity. The family of Seneh, which is the family of the Lemba, are the largest family that came out of captivity. Now, fam, I always invite you to check my math on that. So if you ever get a chance, go and check out, this verse of, Nehemiah 7 verse, and just kind of read the whole thing and just take a look at the number of the Lemba, or of these families that's coming out, and you'll see that Seneh was the largest family coming out. And sure enough, this is where the Lemba come from. So let's keep going here. So let's go to Ezra chapter 9. Now this is starting to get into when Ezra he's realizing that there's a sin that's occurring because the children of Judah, children of Benjamin, the Levites, they're taking these strange wives and they're marrying people that they shouldn't. And so he wants to address it because it's sin in the camp. And there's sin in the camp. Forgive me, I'm kind of looking over at the chat. But there's sin in the camp, and he wants to take care of it or address it. So let's take a look at Ezra chapter 9. Let's start at verse 1. And it says, now when these things were done, the princes came to me saying, the people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the people of the lands, doing according to their abominations. Even the Canaanites and the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites. Verse 2, for they have taken of their daughters for themselves and for their sons, so that the holy seed have mingled themselves with the people of those lands. Yea, the hand of the princes, and rulers have been chief in this trespass. So basically they're saying the princes and the rulers were the worst offenders. So they were the ones that were really marrying, these foreign, strange wives, right? That had to be divorced. And according to the Lemba, this is when their forefathers decided to pull up the stakes from the tents, throw up the deuces, and they was like, we can't do that. We're out. So the Lemba leave. They kind of fade off into history. We don't really, we don't see them after this, right? Or at least we thought so. That's what we thought. However, this is where we find the Lemba. So between the Old Testament and the New Testament, the intertestamental period, right? This is when the Apocrypha, the books of the Apocrypha take place, right? And during that time is the time of the Maccabees, right? If you guys are Marvel fans like I am, and in Marvel, of course you had the Civil War, right? And so just like in Marvel, in Judah had a civil war, and it was basically the Greeks against the Jews. This is why when you get over to the New Testament, it says there's neither Jew nor Greek. essentially they're referring back to this civil war that just occurred. It was a major civil war where thousands of people were killed or died on each side, right? This was a major thing that occurred that, unfortunately, most Christian churches don't talk about. But during this time, it was the time of the Maccabees. So you can see on your screen, I pulled this up. This is from the Encyclopedia Britannica. And it says Maccabees, also spelled Maccabees. It says, a priestly family of Jews who organized a successful rebellion against the Seleucid ruler Antiochus IV and reconsecrated the defiled temple of Jerusalem. So this is kind of where you have the Feast of Dedication come from, right? Where the temple, so the temple at the time in Jerusalem, they were sacrificing pagan stuff in there, swine's flesh, swine's blood at the temple. They even created or built up a gymnasium of all things, over right. I think it's like right next to the temple. So Judas Maccabees, they come in and they cleanse the temple. They tear down all the pagan stuff and they rededicate the temple. Right. And so that's where you get the Feast of Dedication, which you also see take place in, you see reference to it by Hamashiach or the Messiah, over in the New Testament as well. But so during the time of the Maccabees, this is when and where we can find the Lemba in Israel, right? So let's see if we can find the Lemba in Israel. And for that, we're going to read a couple of books here. So this book, you can see I kind of cut off the top part of the book, but it says, The Prophet Isaiah by Albert Barnes. And as I keep going, let's read about it. It says, Moab after the exile. And it says, after the exile, intimate connections took place between the Jews, and the Moabites by marriage. And it says Ezra, I believe that's 9, Nehemiah, and I believe that's kind of read those Roman numbers. I think that's 13. And it says these marriages, however, were dissolved by Ezra. We just read Ezra. It says, as being in his view contrary to the laws of Moses. In the time, in the time of the Maccabees, little mention is made of them. And it says, but Josephus, listen fam, it says, mentions them in the history of Alexander Jannaeus. So Alexander Jannaeus is when and where you can find the Lemba. You can find the Lemba on maps if you look hard enough during the time of Alexander Jannaeus, right? Because remember, so the Lemba left Jerusalem, and then after some time they moved down south through Yemen. But what we're finding out is that when they left Jerusalem, they didn't necessarily leave the area, so to speak, immediately. They kind of moved away, hung out for a little bit, close enough to the city of Jerusalem so that they could benefit from the protection. But then when things got a little heated, then they left. And we know that the Lemba left, of course, before the Messiah shows up, right? And unfortunately, that's why, we do find a lot of our Lemba brothers and sisters don't believe in Messiah, which makes sense because they weren't there when he was there. By the time the Messiah came on the scene, the Lemba were long gone. But coming back to our topic at hand, it says, when during the time of Alexander Jannaeus, and remember this is Josephus talking, right? The historian Josephus. It says Heshbon and Naba, and it says Lemba, and Ornus, and I'm going to mess up some of these names, Elithon and Zara, and it says cities of Moab are mentioned as being in that time in the possession of the Jews, or in the possession of Judah. So during the time of Alexander Jannaeus, the city of Lemba was in the possession of the Jews. Let's read about why this city is in the possession of the Jews. All right, so go to the next page. And so for that, let's pull up the works of Josephus, where it says the antiquity of the Jews. All right, book 8. So the antiquity of the Jews, book 8. This is from Josephus. And let's see, it says, let's go down to number 4. You can see it highlighted there on the screen. It says, now at this time, the Jews were in possession of the following cities that had belonged to the Syrians, Idumeans, and Phoenicians. And it's going to give you a bunch of names of locations and cities, which I'm not going to read, but you're going to see the Lemba, probably 3 lines down. And you'll see Medeba as right next to Lemba. And literally on the map, you'll see Medeba. Yeah, I think I'm pronouncing that right. Next to Lemba. So that's a good way to find out where Lemba is. Find Medeba, right? We're going to check out Lemba. So I just wanted to show you, wanted to capture the legend, on, of this map on the top left-hand corner, just so that you can see where it says Philadelphia and it says city not conquered by Janaeus. But this is during the time of Janaeus, right? Because remember, if you want to find the Lemba, go to the time of Janaeus and look to the right of the Red/Dead Sea. And if you look all the way down at the bottom right on this map, you'll see Medeba and you'll see Lemba. The way I keep it straight, fam, is Lemba is usually between 2 cities. It's between Medeba and it's between Macareus. Right. So that's where Lemba was. And let me zoom in a little bit just so that you can see it better. And remember, this is the territory that John Hyrcanus conquered. He retook this area for Judah. So when the Lemba tell you that they are from the territory of Judah, or they tell you that they're from the territory of Israel, this is what they're talking about, fam. This is what they're talking about. And I did plan on throwing some DNA stuff in here, and I was talking to shout out to Pastor Kelly that's out there, but I did plan on throwing some DNA report in here, but they ended up changing the report between December the 7th to today to actually have a different result set on their webpage, so it doesn't necessarily show Reuben and show how our DNA matches over in that area, because I thought that was a powerful connection piece. But I did reach out to the owner of the DNA site to see if he could put his up. I talked to him. He said he did an update that changed some stuff around. I was like, can you put it back? So anyway, but yeah, if we get that bit of information back, fam, we'll share that via the community page or something like that. But just know, fam, that we do have DNA matches or a match over in this area where it says Lemba, right? And also we do see some DNA matches in My True Ancestry, and it shows up via, I think it's like some sort of Moabite match on our list, on our DNA results as well. But we're not gonna, like I said, we're not gonna touch on that right now. I just wanted to show you where Lemba is located. And this is another map. It's to the right of the Dead Sea during the time of John Hyrcanus, during the time of the Maccabees, right? And Alexander Janaeus. And that's when and where you can find the Lemba. So hopefully, you can understand where the Lemba come from, and just know that when they say that they come from the area territory of Judah, they're not just saying it, fam. There's literally maps to back up what the elders and what the leaders of Lemba are saying. And not only that, we do have DNA to back it up as well. And not only that, over in the territory of Judah, because remember when we were taking a look at the Lakesh relief, because the Lakesh relief is literally on the other side of the Dead Sea. So you have the Lemba on the right side, then you have the Lakesh relief on the left side of the Dead Sea, and that's where you saw the brothers and sisters with the nappy, woolly hair and the nappy woolly beards. We need to see who the Spanish and Portuguese brews are, as the following reference reads, and it reads: King Alonso, whence we may learn, if we can believe it, that a king of Spain who had assisted Nebuchadnezzar in reducing Jerusalem brought an enormous population into Spain, all from either the family of David or at least from the tribe of Judah, and that the royal family resided first in Seville, then in Granada, adding that the exiles afterwards had their numbers greatly increased. by fugitives from the desolation of the Second Temple. And the next reference reads, the Spanish Jews maintain that they had been transported hither after the destruction of the temple by the Babylonian conqueror Nebuchadnezzar. Certain Jewish families, the Ibn Dawuds and the Abarbanels, boasted descent from the royal house of David and maintained that their ancestors had been settled since the time immemorial, partly in the districts of Lucena and partly in the environs of Toledo and Seville. Spanish and Portuguese brews claim their descent from the house of David. And it is the house of King David, along with the nobles and the governors of Judah, who will serve as the first fruits coming out of captivity to rebuild Jerusalem, just as they did when they came out of Babylon. Let's check it out. Let's check out who came out of Babylon to rebuild Jerusalem. Why is it important? Because the same people who returned from Babylon to rebuild Jerusalem the first time will do it again. Nehemiah chapter 7, verse 6 reads, these are the children of the province that went up out of the captivity, of those that had been carried away, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away, and came again to Jerusalem and to Judah, every one unto his city. Verse 7 reads, who came with Zerubbabel. Now we pause and note here that Zerubbabel was part of the group who returned from captivity. Let's now look at the lineage of Spanish and Portuguese brews to see their relationship to Zerubbabel. For this, we will review one of the many ancestry branches of Spanish and Portuguese brews. Now, notice King David and King Solomon are listed as forefathers of the Spanish and Portuguese brews. However, if you drop down to the line with the Roman numeral 3, you'll notice that the third name on that line, coming out of Babylon, is Zerubbabel, spelled with an S. In other words, fam, Spanish and Portuguese brews are descended from Zerubbabel. They are descendant from the people who returned from captivity to rebuild Jerusalem, just like the Lemba in South Africa, which is why your DNA matches the Lemba. And ironically, the brews of Spain and Portugal went into captivity. How do we know that they went into captivity? Well, further down the list, you'll see the name Jachaya, which is the name Yaya. The Yayas become known as the Negroes, and we can find slaves named Yaya on transatlantic slave ship manifests. They were literally on the ship, listed by name. How did they get there? Check this out, fam. Let's take a closer look at the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. Now, once you've navigated to the webpage, click on the link located at the top labeled People of the Atlantic Slave Trade. That's People of the Atlantic Slave Trade. And then click on the word database underneath. This will take you to two databases. One database called African Origins, which lists details of roughly 93,605 Africans taken from captured slave ships or African trading posts. The other database shown is called Ocean's Kinsfolk, which contains roughly 63,000 enslaved African Americans forcibly transported to New Orleans in the 1800s. We find something very interesting when we look into this particular database of slaves. Now, let's select this database and click on the word apply or the apply button located near the bottom. This generates a list of slaves sent to New Orleans. However, a groundbreaking discovery is made when we simply look up all the names on the first page to see if their last names are Sephardic brew names. And you guessed it, fam, shockingly, most of the slave names on the first page are Sephardic brew surnames or Sephardic brew last names. I'll say it another way. These slaves were called by Sephardic brew names. It's interesting, fam. We often wondered what happened to the thousands of black Sephardic brews who made it to America. Many writers will say that they simply disappeared. However, thanks to this database, we now see that there were people with Sephardic brew names being transported as slaves down to New Orleans.